And we're back. If you're watching on the live stream, welcome back. We're at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival here in Berlin. I'm one of the multiple podcast hosts that's sharing the stage here. My name's Paul Bellows. I'm from Western Canada, so I've come a long way to be here in Berlin. It's lovely. I love the city. I love the festival. It's my first time. And we're having conversations with people who are doing interesting things in the public sector or around the public sector. And John, I'm just going to get you to do a quick introduction of yourself to anyone listening at home.
So I'm John Alexander. I wrote a book called Citizens, Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us. I'm currently finishing up a visiting fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I've just published an essay calling for the creation of what I call Departments of Citizen Empowerment, i.e. DOCE rather than Doge. And my work really is at the intersection of community power and participatory democracy. So that's my spiel.
Amazing. I was going to, earlier on, I had one of the many plans I have that I never get to, which I was going to make a Doge t-shirt, but it was just going to be Department of Grift and Extortion. And I was going to sell those around America and then donate all the proceeds to the Southern Law. Anyway, but I didn't do that because I have ideas that I never do daily, really. Just ask my partner. So we started a conversation. I said, let's get to the mic, because I think we need to talk about this. I think it's an interesting conversation. Will maybe be slightly countercultural at a government innovation event. Because as we were talking, sort of talking about what is the DNA and the nature of a government institution? What do we incentivize? How are they working? And one of the things we started to talk about was some of what we need in 2026 in the way public services are delivered is the kind of innovation, change, customer attention, and agility that we typically find more in what we'd call private sector organizations than in public sector organizations, which are more about institution, protection, status quo. And we started a bit of a thread talking about, does innovation even belong within what we typically think of as government organizations?
Yeah, and I suppose I come at this sort of from quite a different angle, which is to say, I think what. So let's take healthcare, because that's the sector you're most interested in. I have a pretty close interest in it as well, and it maybe brings this to life a bit more. So in healthcare, there's sort of two things, arguably. I mean, this is a gross oversimplification, right? But there's kind of two things needed. One is to improve the role of technology, to make things sort of like use that to develop better services. And another is to step back from the current challenges and go, well, actually, like, we know that the social determinants of health are the biggest underlying cause. We know we have epidemics around the world of loneliness and mental ill health. We know that we have the fundamental decline of community life all over the world is actually a major challenge to healthcare. And what we have, arguably, at the moment, in a kind of public sector, in a frame where we see government where we want government to innovate, what we're getting is a kind of quite bad version, arguably, of technological innovation, where, like in the UK, there's this sort of slightly terrifying thing of handing over all of the data to Palantir, essentially, and going like improve delivery in the NHS. And like, it's neither private nor public in any useful way. And in the meantime, like, people in communities around the country are kind of starving for resource and trying to figure out how to come up with new models to take ownership of declining community assets and sort of breathe life into third spaces without any backing from the state. So it's sort of, the state is arguably, and this is a slight kind of the slight frustration of being here and only really hearing people talking about AI, and I'm like, but what we're lacking, I think, is an understanding that the role of the state in empowering citizens, coming in behind what citizens are trying to do, and then maybe the private sector in doing some of the technological innovation, and the state playing more of a kind of coordination role potentially. Like in some research I did recently, we asked people to bring images of their ideal relationship of citizen and state versus the existing. And the existing were like pretty horrific, right? Like, you either get people bringing images of like a drowning, like hands coming out of the sea because they're drowning and overwhelmed, and no one's coming to help them, or you get like a boot crushing people. And but across the political spectrum, the images you get when you ask people for their ideal relationship are like the conductor of an orchestra, loads of hands being raised. You get rowing crews and and government as the like coxswain of a rowing crew. Like, people want to contribute and do something useful and be in community, but they currently feel like government is sort of looking the other way, I think, and trying to do things for them, but in a quite kind of, but failing.
I would deeply agree. You start to think about what are the capabilities we want in a government organization. What type of people should work there? How should they operate? What skills and capacities should they have? I can recall years ago in my career, because I spent about 30 years running a digital agency and sort of building, like user experience design and research and getting out and meeting with citizens and understanding. And that was a big part of my life. I can remember this one beautiful moment where I was in with a government IT department, and one of the team members there said, well, you guys get to do all the fun stuff. He said, you think the work I do is fun? Like just wrestling with people and understanding their needs and sorting through all this complexity. And I said, I don't think anything, sure, you're dealing with like servers and infrastructure and that complexity, but I said, what I do isn't more fun. It's hard and challenging and painful in a different way than what you're doing. So, but it's also a really deep skill set. I said, I don't think you could do what I do, because my team has spent decades building this capacity, this unique way to get out and invent what doesn't exist and shape that and refine it and make it work for people and execute on it and deliver it and scale it. So that's what we do. This is my skill set. And then you bring that to healthcare. And it's so interesting because in Canada, so I'm coming from a Canadian perspective, and I'm assuming UK perspective, where our public health institutions are national treasures and deeply prized. And us in Canada, the great fear is we look at the US and look at some of the inequity that exists in the system. And we say, we're proud of the equity and the social responsibility in our system. We look south of the border and see America and say, well, we can't have private delivery in healthcare. And that's a great fear in Canada. So, we a lot of the decisions we make in Canada are a reaction to a model we see that is, values opposed to what we're doing. But then you look at Japan, where they've got a hybrid, in every way, and around how health insurance and clinical service delivery and emergency service delivery, and it's working beautifully with great equity and at about half the operational cost of what's happening in Canada, because they have the best of both worlds operating together and in balance. And I so often think it's how do we create that balance between all the parts of our society, both commercial interests and private sector interests, as well as public interests and public sector interests. And I think often, especially, like UK and Canada specifically, I think often we make decisions really out of fear of what could become, rather than looking at the opportunity to say, how do we bring the most innovation in the best possible way into the organization? What skills do those look like? How do we embrace failure and success at the same time? And just maximize the opportunity to deliver the best service that we possibly could at the best total cost.
And again, I think that's like, I don't know. I worry about the language of service delivery. Actually, like I'm because ultimately where I get to is like, so let's go back right to the beginning of the NHS, right? In the UK, and again, national treasure status for sure. But at the outset, in the Second World War in 1943, William Beveridge published this report called calling on the four great evils or whatever, and he put out the idea of a national health service. But Beveridge also wrote another report a few years later where he felt like he'd made a significant mistake in ignoring the value of the voluntary in the community. And what we've built over the last 80 years, I think. I'm in my work, I argue, I offer this way of seeing the moment in time we're living in through the lens of what I call stories of self and society. And my argument is that we've become trapped in what I call the consumer story. This idea that people are inherently and inevitably lazy, self-interested individuals who are kind of maximizing self-interest at all times on the basis that if we all maximize self-interest, that will add up to the collective interest. I think that story, that whole underlying thing is falling apart because you can't solve loneliness, inequality, climate from within that story, because like there is no way for us to come together on massive collective action problems from within a story of ourselves that says we're lazy individuals. And so to come back to your thing, like I'm like, part of it might be that the incentives for and the skills aren't there for the kind of innovation that we need the private sector to drive. But I'd also argue that the skills aren't really there for the things we need to support community and belonging that are essential to humanity. Like, so I'm in a lot of my work, the sorts of skills I'm teaching, I'm trying to get people to adopt and develop are facilitation skills. And funnily enough, by the way, I came from the same background. I started my career in the advertising industry. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a different thing.
I've been on a journey. I mentioned this before we started talking, but I've been working through the entire Jane Jacobs canon. And for those who don't know, Jane Jacobs was originally an American who eventually came to Canada and lived in Toronto. She was from New York, then came to Toronto. And what she's most known for is urban design and the theory of urban design. If you've heard of 15-minute cities, that's Jane Jacobs' theory of people need to, she talks about cross-purpose in the design of a city. People need to be, city streets are safe when people are on those streets. Children are safe on streets when many children are on the streets, and that's encouraged, and adults are there with them, and people are moving, and different types of people moving throughout the day. And so, she talks about this need to design cities that serve the needs of all the people who are residents of those cities. Yeah. She said, there's so much that is inversed in our thinking about city design that she really critiques. Like she says, parks, when they are needed, are useful. Parks, when they are just dropped in by a city planner, that's where the drug dealers go to hang out. They become danger zones in a community, and there's no one there during the day, there's no one there late at night. Those become dark patches within the community that are negative spaces of the community that actually work against community safety. And I think so, but she talks about good urban design as just really looking at, is there good motion between blocks? Have we encouraged the right kind of development? Have we thought about street front, like storefront, so there's retail, there's a reason to go to the hardware store, then to the bakery, and then walk to, the bank down the way. Do people move across spaces? Because that's really what we need in a city. And I think that's the work that government can do really well. But should government be planning where the baker goes? Should the government be designing the hardware store and stocking it? Well, no, that would be ridiculous. That becomes, sort of 60s communist supply theory, right? Like that, so where do we want government to play, especially in the innovation space, and in the technology implementation space? And where should government be setting context and policy and be a curator, potentially, but not the operator and the delivery mechanism?
Right. And I think Jane Jacobs also wrote a book called The Citizen City, I believe. And I think a lot of that was about the idea that you're creating spaces for people that are designed around the idea of people as members of communities who need to interact with one another, as you say. And I think, I guess in its, I don't know, this is interesting conversations. I hadn't thought of it quite like this before, but I wonder maybe if where our views might converge is an idea that in its sort of like private sector status envy of the last 30, 40 years, government has tried to do what the private sector does and actually abandoned a lot of the role of supporting and standing up for the importance of community. So private sector, maybe it's right for private sector organisations to treat people as consumers and to be actors in a market. It might not be right for government to behave like that, actually. Governments might need to treat us as citizens and stand up for society and say that there is something beyond the market, and not just cater to individual self-interest, but in its sort of, in its private, maybe we could argue that in its sort of private sector status envy, as I just articulated out of nowhere, fine. What's happened is that government is sort of aping the private sector and not doing that particularly well because it's not equipped to do it and the structures and systems aren't fit for it. but it's also abandoned its role as a champion of community and a space for people to come together. I mean, I'm kind of shocked at this government innovation conference. There's no talk of democratic innovation as far as I can see. I haven't heard one person talk about citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting or legislative theatre, or like, which are mechanics and processes that are tried and tested and proven to increase trust in government. And I can't understand why. And maybe it's because we're so busy talking about and envying the private sector. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, so I'm going to bring it back to Jane Jacobs again for a second, who she's accidentally become our theme here.
I'm going to crash your podcast for a second. Is it okay if we throw Jeff into the mix here, just to throw some fisticuffs at this guy?
Bring it.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah. Okay. So Jeff is going to come in. Jeff Mulligan. So this is going to get even more interesting here. So. Come on in, Jeff. We're talking Jane Jacobs and why government has no place in the innovation space.
That's a weird summary.
It's a weird summary, but those are some themes we've touched on. Yeah, come on in. Yeah. So one of Jane Jacobs' later works was Systems of Survival. And in it, she talks about two classes within the society. So, this is a model. Do you want to sit here, Jeff? And we're just handing one mic around. Oh, they find that cup. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. This is a very casual podcast, and we're sort of bouncing around here. So in Systems of Survival, Jacobs talks about this guardian class and the commerce class, and she says the commerce class has always been, since the days of the merchants, and like innovation, what do people want, and how do we give them what they want, and how do we sell the best product, and how do we adjust. And the guardian class was originally nobility, and then government structures, and they're here to protect, and they're here to create institutions, they're here for largesse and to build concert halls and to create environments. But she has this one beautiful part of the book where she says, some of the worst things in society come when they try and do each other's jobs. She says, if you take guardian class and commerce class, that becomes the mafia. That's how the mafia operates. They are both the guardian class and the commerce class. Or you think of sort of some of the worst things that government is sometimes known for, bringing on these big, expensive projects that produce no outcome. So how do we all, and again, I think where it really comes together is to say, we are one society, Government is us, and businesses are us, and citizens are us. How will we manage ourselves? How will we come together to produce the best outcomes for all of us? And I think people get so ideological about it, but sometimes I think we can back off and say, well, you're right, as you were saying, maybe we do need government to worry less about how we implement AI and more about how we make sure that elections are effective and transparent and clear. How do we engage citizens in elections? What is the core business of government? And one of the things that we were just discussing before you joined was, it's interesting that we're at an innovation conference and it's all about how do we add the next great AI feature to the table without really any core talk about that basic operational, mandate of government of, elections and lawmaking and enforcement of laws. And it is surprisingly absent from an innovation conference that we're not talking. So we've walked you into the midst of this, giving you very little background on what got us to here, but I'm just going to hand you the mic and see where you go with this.
Well, let's go back to Jane Jacobs, because I think everyone should be familiar with Systems of Survival, which is one of the great books of the last 50 years. And in particular, is very good on the pathologies of what happens if business becomes like a state, essentially running our utilities, which is roughly what's happened, but also actually the risks of certain kinds of creativity in the state and entrepreneurialism. So she warns very strongly against an entrepreneurial state where civil servants think like entrepreneurs, because that ends up with corruption. And you see that in China and some other countries where the state has created loads of enterprises competing with business, often unfairly, but with horrible results. And I think the deep insight she has that any complex society depends on really quite different moral syndromes. You want your auditors and accountants to think in a certain way. You want your builders to think in a certain way, your carers, your politicians, your bureaucrats. And they're different moral syndromes, but which complement each other to make a good society. And if they get too muddled up or confused, horrible things happen. And Mary Douglas is the other person who wrote really well about this in anthropology, and yet almost no one's familiar with those literatures. Almost no economist has ever taught any of this stuff. So they get very, very confused. And you can see around AI horrible confusions of moral syndromes right now, with people not understanding what the limitations should be, except perhaps the Pope. Pope Leo has definitely waded into this this discussion. So I wasn't expecting us to go there, but I think it's a great sort of direction to go, because in a way it's saying, whatever your role, be aware of where you should be self-limiting, where you may be overstepping the boundaries of your moral syndrome.
So one of the things I was saying, Jeff, and I'd be interested in your take on this, but I was mentioning another Jane Jacobs classic. I think The Citizen City was a Jacobs book as well, right? And as I understand it, and I don't think I've read as deeply as you guys have into this, but one of the things she was talking about is the need for spaces that enable people to come together, to interact in different ways, to come together across difference. And I was, in the conversation we were sort of roaming through, and I guess, holding this hypothesis that maybe part of where we are now is government actually, is there an argument, that government has now sort of become so focused on how do we use AI to improve services, how do we deliver services better, that what we're not doing is focusing enough on how do we hold the space for community and the space for those interactions. So, and a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment, I'm spending a lot of time with people in organisations building from the grassroots up, where they are trying to find new ways of financing and owning public infrastructure, which the state has receded from, arguably kind of pursuing an idea of people of needing to deliver services for people ever more effectively, but not seeing them as not holding the space for people as citizens to come together in community. Do you think that's fair, or do you think that's going a whole other way?
No, and I think when Jane Jacobs first became famous for her arguments against Robert Moses in New York, he was the sort of top-down planner, sweep away whole neighborhoods, build massive bridges, and she said, a good city is one where people are interacting at a very local level, in the street, in the community, and she successfully blocked a lot of Moses's arguments. And I think you, in any society, need both and this is where I guess I take a controversial view, that you sometimes do need someone to build the ring road, or build, like London's just done, a massive new sewer system to replace the 19th century one, or high-speed rail as China's done, but you also need neighborhood and community. And what's fascinating in a country like the UK now, according to Elon Musk, everyone hates everyone else. We're about to have a civil war. Community is totally broken down. If you ask people, do you get on with your neighbors? The results are stronger than 20 years ago, stronger than 30 years ago. Are you at ease living next to someone from a different race? Stronger bonds than in the past. So we've got this weird era where actually a lot of the fabric of civil society is fairly healthy in terms of everyday human interactions. But the presentation through the horrible distorted lens of social media makes people think everything is falling apart and disastrous and chaotic and full of conflict. So to me, I actually totally agree with you, John, but if we don't fix the social media representation of our society, then we will actually lose precisely the dynamics you're describing.
There's nothing novel about observing that social media amplifies the worst, because that's the incentive, because we are a species that craves safety. We crave belonging, and so to find those tribal moments or those moments of connection, that's not novel. But I think where we do miss is we've lost local media. We've lost local storytelling. We don't tell stories about our neighbors. We tell national stories. We tell international stories. We tell stories that are about danger, about collapse, about misfortune. Disaster is the narrative, the story, and so no wonder we see it everywhere we go. But I would agree with you. The data says we like our neighbors. We get along with people near us. We feel safe when we're on a bus with other people that are just other people. These are the spaces where we feel safe. The problem may not be that. The problem may be that we're incentivizing a narrative.
So about 10, 15 years ago, it became obvious local and hyperlocal media were being destroyed, mainly by advertising revenue going to Facebook and Google. They essentially sucked it out from the entire planet, and that destroyed local media. So in my last job, I set up a hyperlocal media program where we funded innovations. This was across the UK, and the Knight Foundation was doing it in the US at the same time, to experiment with new models which could be more sustainable, some wholly community-based, some using schools, so why not train teenagers in making local news content, and why not have, you know, sports and music and stuff like that. And there's actually loads of examples now around the world of how do you rebuild hyperlocal media. We tried to get the BBC to support it. They almost did, and then the politicians undermined it. It's another story. And it still seems to me weird. In so many cities, you can find out more about the latest bombing of Beirut than you can about what's happening 2 streets away from you. So this seems to be an eminently fixable problem that, alongside fantastic and international and national media, you should, every neighborhood should have somewhere, you know, where you can find out what's going on. People can come together. You can find out about your local municipality, what they're doing, what they're not doing. And it's weird to me that this still is so patchy and so much really a blind spot for public policy.
But to come back to your both and, which I think is probably going to be the tension in our little debate later as well. Like, is it? Ooh.
Speaking of your debates,
Yeah.
we have the host and moderator of your debate here to join in and stir the pot. So can I
This is
throw,
getting richer and richer.
can I throw her in to mix the
More.
pot a little bit?
Bigger, please. Yes.
Are you
Yeah.
ready for this, John? Are you prepared?
This wasn't what I signed up for, but
Just keep throwing people at you.
This is improv. Yeah.
is Jeff running away now?
We can probably get you some help with the power.
Get this power there. Yeah. So John, no, sorry, what you're saying in terms of the tension?
Well, I guess there's I think what I'd argue is that we've when the logic that is structuring and the idea of the individual that's structuring how we're doing these things, the dominant logic is the idea of people as consumers. The idea that government should make the decisions for people, particularly when it comes to big infrastructure projects. The place that people are left in on those big infrastructure projects is then feedback and complaint. And then we don't seem to be embracing the modes of decision making that could involve people up front early in those processes. And the dominant logic is kind of efficiency, get it done, and then it gets unpicked later. We don't have something like the BBC, which you just mentioned. We haven't shifted the governance structures to have people more involved in those. I know you're kind of quite keen on a lot of the same things I am from the perspective of citizens' assemblies, government and participatory democracy, these kind of things. But it seems odd to me to go to sort of say there's a both and, when it feels like there's a very dominant logic that say in government today, which is like we have to do things for people.
Shall I disagree with you? If you want a bit of disagreement.
Yeah, hit me.
Yeah. So I live in a town called Luton, which has an airport, and the airport's been trying to expand for many years, and actually now is expanding. And there is endless consultation and dialogue in the town about whether this is good or bad. Almost none of it is from a consumer's perspective. I mean, a little bit is, because some people want, you know, more flights to get to Spain or whatever. It's mainly an argument about balancing a set of environmental goals around clean air, jobs for the community and young people, and some people who just hate the idea of building anything. And, you know, you can disagree with where that debate ends up, but it's just not accurate to say it's done through a consumerist lens. And there are conflicting interests. And overall, because it's quite a poor town, actually the jobs argument tends to win out over the anxieties about noise and throughput of people. In fact, the environmental issues are not so bad. Anyway, just a live example, which I live literally this last week. We had yet another of these sort of consultations on it. And, you know, to me, that's democracy being healthy. There are different views, different interests, different perspectives, and they clash and they're argued through. And in the end, the town council owns the airport. This is a public infrastructure. It actually has subsidized our council massively in the last decade because it was cut by central government. And, anyway, it's, I think, a relatively positive example, even if you don't like air flight from a climate change point of view, but which just makes me question this sort of simple consumer v citizens framing.
But then I guess, so take a bigger project, so something like HS2, where the debate hasn't really been had, arguably, with people. There have been many consultations, but very disparate feedback on the plan, the only opportunity being to protest against rather than to kind of create the plan from the beginning.
Well, all the democratically elected people in the north of England strongly supported it. I think they were wrong, but they did support it. So it was one political pull pointing towards spend a shitload of money on this big high-speed rail line, and lots of people whose houses were going to be affected generally against it. So again, it was clashing interests more, I think, than a clash between consumer and citizen perspectives. So are we disagreeing too much?
No, this is the right amount of disagreement, because also I know here at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, where we're live streaming from, there's a debate coming up where we're going to start to tackle some of these specific things. So I don't want you to spend all of your powder. I want to keep some powder dry for that.
HS2 is a very inefficient project. Right. So it's like many of these infrastructure things, massively over budget, to shave a few minutes off the time it takes to get from London to Birmingham, and it probably won't even get to Manchester. So it's one of the projects which actually makes me really focused on efficiency in the public sector, which John is going to argue against, because I hate to see billions wasted on bad projects which could be serving the public interest better.
It's such, yeah, please.
So I guess, I think I've sort of strolled into this in slightly weird ways. I can't quite work out how we've got here, in total honesty. But the stepping back from it, I think that the case I am arguing is that there is more of a role for government as to see itself as a convener and coordinator of collective intelligence. Something like an HS2, if you went right back up the process, major infrastructure project, like actually directly working with people to say, like, how do we renew our public infrastructure as a country, holding that question with people from moment one, with assemblies and participatory budgeting and all those kinds of things as mechanics within that, rather than being caught in these mechanisms. So where I would put the some of the blame for where we've ended up on H2, and I'm really like questioning myself as to whether I wanted to be here as an example that we're discussing, but we are now. Like where people's only involvement in these major decisions is through what I would describe as a consumer dynamic of an election, where you choose between a fixed set of options to give your power to, rather than actually having a voice in the ongoing process.
Recording it, unfortunately, so it was worse than you're describing. Whereas I actually agree with you. If there'd been a public dialogue saying, let's say we've got 100 billion to spend on infrastructure, where should we spend it? And in my view, buses are a much better claim than high-speed rail. Right. But people weren't quite given the choice in that format, and the debate didn't really happen. So I'm afraid on that, we're probably going to agree.
Well, where this does loop right back to where we started at the beginning was, what are the competencies we wish our government institutions to have? Right. Is it being masterful builders of high-speed rail? Or is it being managers of budgets, solicitors of public opinion, brokers of decisions, and negotiators.
National conversation, like facilitators of national conversation.
So I think it does illustrate
all the other things you listed. I mean, there's no point being good at a conversation if you can't do stuff well.
Or oversee the doing of stuff, setting standards, setting policy, setting guidelines, laying out the riverbanks, and letting others execute. Who have those.
But sometimes governments have to do stuff as well.
No, absolutely, yeah. I don't think there's a clear line, but I think it is an interesting conversation to have had today to say,
I guess, sorry, this is back into the bit of the disagreement, and I think this is the dynamic that we'll get into a little later, because my take would be that the skill set of and the mindset of holding those spaces has to come first. Like, when the concept of efficiency comes in, it tends to obliterate all else because it's a very different mindset. It's in the frame of delivery. It's in the frame of.
Come on and Lisa, have a seat.
Yeah, she gets more of this in a moment.
More, and we're in the midst of it. Oh yeah.
So you get. This keeps happening at a point where I feel like we're just getting into a place where I feel like I'm in the conversation, and then it changes again. I'm like, what's going on here? Oh, there we go.
Are you good at being agile?
Decreasingly so. No, so how do we even summarize this? Are we still going? I think we're in danger of entering the topic of conversation for the debate in an hour or so's time. But I think the broad argument I'm coming from is that the frame of efficiency comes from a very different place to the frame of facilitation of participation. And the two do cut across each other, I think, is the argument I'm making. Rather than being able to be held as dual priorities, you kind of have to choose.
So let me disagree, and I won't say this in the debate, but much of the history of democracy and politics is about tax and tax revolt. Every peasants' revolt started with people really resenting taxes being taken from them. The US, independence began with the tax revolt. And the reason is that most people don't have much money, and they really hate to see their money being wasted. And that's why I would actually argue efficiency and accountability for spending of money is absolutely at the core of every democratic constitution, of every relationship between a state and its citizens. And if it can't look them in the eyes and say, we are using your hard-earned money really well, we're not wasting it, we're not overpaying ourselves, we don't have lavish palaces where we spend all our time, we don't go home at lunchtime because we can. If you can't do that, you're actually betraying democracy. And that's why I think efficiency is not a kind of technocratic managerial add-on. It's actually core to the democratic relationship.
The only correction I'll make is I do believe the tea went into the harbor over taxation without representation. It wasn't the taxation itself. It's what I got for my money.
Yeah, and ever since tax has not been an issue in American
Not at all. Good news is we haven't talked about it since. Yeah, no, absolutely. Now I'm gonna put a pin in this conversation because I think we could go for about 2 more hours on this theme, and this was fantastic. Lisa, where we got to really is just to talk about the start of this was. We're at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. We're surrounded by people discussing government and innovation. And so much of it has been, how do we bring in AI? How do we bring in new technology? How do we do all these new things? And one of the observations we make is, we're not having a lot of conversations about the good old core competencies of government, of building legislation and policy and enforcing and election management and democracy itself. Where's our innovation in democracy? And that sort of led us on a whole series through healthcare and high-speed trains and what should government do and what should government stay out of, which has been fascinating. But I know that you've spent a career in this space. I'd just love to hear maybe some thoughts, based on that conversation. We spent a lot of time talking about Jane Jacobs too, and many of her theories, and we all love Jane Jacobs. But maybe some thoughts, to talk about that. And then I understand you've got some career change coming up. I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit about that too.
So it's great to be with you two guys, John and Jeff, such smart guys in this space. Jeff moderated a beautiful round table without a table conversation around innovation. And I shared there that when Robin, Scott, and I co-founded Apolitical 12 years ago, we started asking people in government, old, young, all types of governments you can imagine, Global South, North, blah, blah, blah. And we kind of thought we were going to be smart ladies. It must be that you need new ideas, right? You must need a lot of ideas. And they're like, no, actually, maybe, but what we need more is this sense of belonging, which is what the Creative Bureaucracy Festival does, a sense of appreciation, which is the core of kind of how we've built our organization, putting the public servants at the center. And the basic things that you need, like, do I have a good manager? Can I communicate effectively? How do I build resilience? Yes, and then how do I use AI and all of these new tools? How do I write effectively? One interesting thing that we've done besides the peer-to-peer learning, which is the core of what we do, and now we have some new tools that help people understand how AI might come for their job and how they may need to reskill in government, is we have communities of practice, and our largest community besides AI are neurodiverse people in government. And I think imagine if you don't feel a sense of belonging inside of government as a human, and then you're neurodiverse and you don't know, your managers don't know how to. So sometimes I think because we like shiny objects, because we want to sound smart, we do let's have the big innovation things. But what about what people need, who they are, where they come from, as the base of the pyramid, and then you go up from there.
I think it's a really interesting piece of punctuation that you just put on the conversation we've had, which is, sometimes government just isn't very good at doing the core things that they're supposed to be doing. Sometimes they just do it poorly, and sometimes they do things they have no business doing. All these things can be true at the same time. And so often politics itself gets in the way of, a four-year election cycle, et cetera. Building healthy organizations with strong competencies and what we need the most to do, and people empowered to do those things. And so I think it's a really good human lens to bring back onto this. But Derek is going to be angry at me if I don't ask you again the question, because I think you just recently made a little announcement about how things are changing, which is an exciting moment of growth for your organization. Can I ask you about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to remember that institutions and government are made of people. And I'm a very much talent is really important. Talent, motivation, human beings until we're taken over by the machines, if we are. James Lovelace said there are three options. He's the Gaia theory guy who died. And his last thing was, we will either be taken as houseplants and sort of coexist with us as houseplants. We will coexist as human and humanoids, or we'll all be killed. So I'm hoping at least for coexistence. If not, maybe a houseplant would be quite good. But institutions are made of people, so it's a people business that I'm in. So the last 5 years, I think, just to step back, I've been a political entrepreneur all my life, which is just basically a fancy way of saying, looking at how to make politics better, audaciously trying to do that. I don't think anyone would argue that that's not something that needs to probably happen. Think of Jeff's done a lot of work in this space. And so 30 years ago, I co-founded what we now call a political leadership incubator. So how do you get new and different people into politics from different parts of the state in Washington, and we've scaled it. And what I found really interesting was most political parties were made to get people elected, but they weren't made necessarily, and that's just the incentive structure around it, to bring in transformational humans. So I've learned a lot about how do you screen for character. I just have a piece out today that I wrote on the triangle of sadness and what power does to the brain. Did you guys see the Triangle of Sadness film? It's quite interesting. Would you become the toilet maid at the end? What does she do with a rock? Anyway, it's a teaser if you haven't seen it. But there's a lot to learn about power in the brain with billionaires and puking and fish and withholding sex and submarines. That's your little teaser. So we've worked a lot on how do you do transformational political leaders? How do you actually do the politics yourself? But then how do you actually find people in politics that love policymaking and governing? And if you don't want to govern, if you don't want to do the policymaking, whether that's, John and I have talked a lot about this, and he did really important work with Omazin Khalifa on the participatory stuff, how do you bring that more in? But most people, almost all people who go into politics, have no experience with government at all, besides maybe paying their taxes. Let's hope that they do that. Anyway, so I've been doing that for about 30 years. The last 6 years, I've built that capacity up within the organization, and I've got builder energy. I like building things. I'm kind of a serial accidental builder. Maybe it's a condition, I'm not sure. And every 10, 11 years, I get this I should step back and see how the world has changed. 11 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I had this moment in my life of don't mistake activity for progress. And that's kind of a thing that's in front of my mind all the time. So I've got a great team. I just worked with two of our chief strategy officer and our chief operational officer. They're now co-CEOing the organization, and I'm executive chairing, taking the summer off. I'll still be working, still on the board of Apolitical and executive chair. And it doesn't mean I'm leaving everything. I'm just kind of thinking about what's next. And I don't even want to make any provocations. I don't even want to like the one thing I will say that's heavy on my mind is politics is downstream of culture. That's the thing I'm thinking a lot about. And I say this on the day of the kickoff of the World Cup, and the amount of attention that people will give. I'm a basketball fan, so I'm watching the Knicks. Like the opportunity to speak to people in these culture spaces, and I mean culture broadly, is something I'm going into, not just watching a lot of World Cup and NBA Finals basketball, but the role that culture can play in shaping the way we think about one another.
I don't think we could have covered more territory in 40 minutes. This was a lot of fun. I wish we had
I want to come back on Jeff's tax.
2 hours. I know. I'm coming to your debate, though, in a little bit. The theme that walked through all the different conversations, winding through healthcare and high-speed rail and organizational development, people, this is all about the needs of people. This is all about helping people to thrive. And then building institutions that help people to thrive within the institution and on behalf of the institution, and I think that's a worthwhile wrap up. I think that's great. So I just want to say thanks to all of you for joining in staggered succession, for dropping into the middle of a complex and heated conversation at moments. Pleasantly heated, absolutely. Conflict is necessary because the problems are worth solving. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We're going to take a moment and we're going to adjust, and I believe we have some Kenyans who are going to join us, and I'm excited to hear about an African continent perspective on some of these.